I've really never spoken about the latter four worlds, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. What exactly is going on? And, what is going on with these four worlds? What are the stages? Stages of what? You have the world of, you have the Atzilus, okay, Bria. I mean, we know what exists in these worlds, what's produced, but are these separate worlds? No, obviously they're not. They're stages. Stages of what? You need four different stages.
Right.
For what?
Of the Zulasa.
Well, what I've said, they're fundamentally, in normal Kabbalah, these are stages of the Olamus.
Right.
I don't know if there's really a discussion of what these are stages of, but I've said these are stages of the Zulosoi. But in terms of what? What stages of the Zulosoi exist? So I think I've said this before. I don't know. There's stages in referring to the tikkun of Namdak Sufra. So these are the tikkun stages of the Zulosoi as he approaches the ability to Masaka Namdak Sufra. So that's the definition of what do we mean by stages of the Zulosoi. They refer to four separate stages or phases of a gradual increasing acquisition of the principles which it needs to Masaka Namdak Sufra. So I want to start with that and then go from there deeper into what's going on. And we've never really done this.
Right.
And this will give you a much sharper understanding, because most of the time we've really concentrated on the beginning of creation, which means it's from the Olam of the Ein Sof and so on, and the Olam of the Zulosoi, the Ein Sof, Hatzmusoi, what's the relationship, or it's called the subjects.
Right.
You know what I mean? That fundamentally there are three subjects to creation. There's Atzmusoi, which is a subject, but it's really beyond the subject. The next stage is the Ein Sof, which is the God version of God in the world of Yesod, or in the world of the Ein Sof, which means, and it's a world which is beyond entity. And then finally in the stage of the Zulosoi. But the Ein Sof and the Zulosoi really belong to one stage, and Atzmusoi belongs to another stage. You know what I mean? So the world of God is called the world of Atzmusoi, and that we have no understanding of. The fundamental principle that applies to that world is Einoid Mulvadoi. That, and in my language, it means that God has no outside. That's the maximum way to understand it. It's not that there's one God. It has nothing to do with the fact of one. It has to do with the fact of number. There's no number even. When you're looking at God himself, there's no application of the rule of numbers.
Yeah, it's recording.
Oh. Because you can't give numbers to something which has no duality. For the rule of the dominion of number to be applicable, or mathematics, which is the concept of number, the world has to be within the concept of duality, the number two. What does that mean? That you have to have two entities or two variations of something. That's the world of number. You can also have one thing, but that one thing has to have the possibility of another thing. So you're still in the world of duality. Whether there's a real duality or an artificial duality, you're in the world of duality. But in the world of no number whatsoever, there's no possible duality at all, which means that you are beyond the world of number. So therefore, where does the world of duality start? In the world of the Zolosoi. And what exactly is the world of the Zolosoi? Well, it starts with a fundamental partner in creation. And what's the fundamental partner to creation? It's the fundamental partner in creation is a certain version of God. And that version is called the Ein Sof. So God in the world of duality is beyond concept. But that's the world that begins the world of duality. The other part of the world is the Zolosoi, who's in that category. But you see, the Ein Sof and the Zolosoi is really, the Zolosoi is really, what the real term for the Zolosoi is the world of Zolosoi, which means except or outside of. But that really, the term Zolosoi is the world of Yesef. That's what they really call them. So the world of what's called the Zolosoi in general is the world of the Ein Sof, which is the version of God, and the world of Yesef, which is the Zolosoi. And it's the two of them together that are part of this world that have to do with the reality of a Sof.
What would you call that world?
Well, I would call that world the world of the Zolosoi. It's the beginning of the world of Zolosoi. In other words, technically speaking, the Ein Sof is part of the world of the Zolosoi. Why? Because he is a version of God in the world of Zolosoi. Except in that version of God, in that world, he's not subject to a concept. Because he doesn't have any boundaries.
But this is different than what you've previously stated. Meaning that the Ein Sof is the Zulaso in its highest form.
Yeah.
So you're backtracking on that a little bit, or?
Right. To Zolosoi, that's a tricky question that I have not really answered completely. Why is that? Because the Zolosoi, as we know it, is a recipient of Olam Haba. The Ein Sof is not a recipient of Olam Haba. But yet, why is he ever in the world of duality? Because he's called Ritzonoi. He's referred to as the Rotzen of God. And the Rotzen of God is a concept where God suddenly has a desire to do something. It's the concept of will. That's what Ritzonoi means. And will, according to me, doesn't exist in the world of Atzmusoi. I mean, that nobody says this, but to me this is an absolute truth. The world of Atzmusoi, in that world, God has no will. And we don't even understand what that means.
Okay.
Because God, there's no manifestation of a will at all.
Right.
Why? Because there's nothing to will.
Right.
God doesn't want anything. It's not only the impossibility of need, God doesn't need anything, but the impossibility of wanting it. You don't even want anything. Why? Because there's nothing outside of you. So if you want something, it's because you don't have it. But if there's no outside, there's nothing that God wants at all. So there's no possibility of wanting anything. We can't conceive of that. You know what I mean? So that's why there's a concept of, because the word Ein Sof, what does the word Ein Sof mean? It applies to something which is beyond a concept, which means it has no edge. It doesn't have something which you can say, this is that, the quality. It has no qualities, nothing. That's what a world is beyond the Zulasoi. But the Ari says that the Ein Sof, even though it refers to a stage of non-concept, so it cannot be conceived, the mind of man, the human intelligence, the mind of his self-awareness, is that he can understand a concept. Every concept has a representation in his mind, but a concept is something that there is. A concept is something which is defined by a certain quality. But if the thing has no qualities to it, why? Because there's no such thing as a concept. So it's indescribable. In other words, it's beyond the human mind. It's beyond awareness itself. But the Ein Sof is not beyond the quality of what? Of a will.
Right.
But that's enough. Because the Ein Sof is considered the will of God.
So then it is God. But I want to clear.
I know. I hope you understand the concept of a non-concept.
That I understand.
That
I can't understand it, but I can understand it.
Fine. Well, you can understand what it's not.
Right.
You can't understand it,
but
what it's not.
Right.
That you can understand.
That I understand.
And we understand the concept refers to a quality that you possess that describes you. The Ein Sof has no qualities at all that could be conceived of in any sense. It's beyond understanding. So in Kabbalah, the Kabbalah says God, in the version of the Zolosoi, as far as the Zolosoi is concerned, because he has needs and wants, is a version called Ein Sof. It's beyond, what is its maximum height in terms of how high it is? It's beyond concept. But Atzmusoi has nothing to do with either being in the world of concepts or not being in the world of concepts. Both worlds are irrelevant to the Atzmusoi. You know what I mean? So Atzmusoi is an absence of concept. But that itself is still in the world of the Zulosoi. So the Ein Sof is not God. And the Ramchal says this. I think the Vatzcham, the Vilna Gaon, and so on. But that's clearly true. So the world of Atzmusoi is beyond either possessing a concept or not possessing, not being in the world of concepts. So it's beyond both presence or the absence of concept. So what do you have? You have nothing. I mean, for all practical purposes, when you're looking at Atzmusoi, you're looking at something of empty space, nothing.
Right.
And that cannot be imagined. So the Ein Sof is a version of God which is one step away from what? Of being beyond everything, either the presence or the absence of concepts. So we say that the Ein Sof is beyond concept. That's its definition. And the Zolosoi is within the world of concept. So the presence and the absence of concepts defines the world of the Zolosoi, but not the world of Atzmusoi. So therefore, God has a certain manifestation in the world of the world of Zolosoi, and that world is the world of the absence of concepts. There's such a thing, and so on.
So Lamaisa.
So that's why, and what is that quality? But the Ari says
It's a will.
That's a will. Well, that's a concept. Once you say will, you're talking about something. And will is a noun. It's something. What is the will alone? We don't know. What does that mean that the Ein Sof is the will of God? We don't know. But that's what entitles the Ein Sof to be a God to the Zulosoi. That he is the God who unites with the Zulosoi. So fundamentally, what's the difference between the Zulosoi and the Ein Sof? Well, technically speaking, he is part of the Zulosoi and he's not part of the Zulosoi, the Ein Sof. So the Zulosoi relates to the Ein Sof as an organism. In other words, they're connected in some way because the Zulosoi is a product of the will.
Right.
So he's in that world.
Well, he's
product.
derived from the Ein Sof.
Yeah, he's a product of it. It's a product which is connected to the world of the Ein Sof, which is a world of will, but it's not a world of substance or things, and we cannot understand it. And in a certain way, he's more than that. The relationship of the Zulosei, which is what we are, is related to the world of the Ein Sof in a certain sense. And what is that sense? And that's the distinction between an or and the keli. Because in the world of the world of the Ein Sof is said to be an or, but it's really not an or because an or is something. So it's not that, but the closest thing that it resembles is ha'ora, an or. You mean? And what the Zulosei represents is the beginning of a keli, which is an or itself attached to another or, higher. Because fundamentally, what is a Zulosei? The structure of a Zulosei is an or that has attached to it a keli. And what is that keli? A vessel? It's another or, it's also an or, but it's a smaller or, it's a distant or. And that's where the actual Zulosei is real. So therefore the Zulosei itself structurally is a keli in an or.
Is a keli in an or.
The pure or itself, without any keli,
Is the Ein Sof.
is the Ein Sof.
And it's located within the Ein Sof, the Zulasa.
Right, but there's a certain part of it, that or, which is an or, which is affixed to a keli.
Right.
So part of the keli is connected to an or, and there's a certain amount of outside the or, outside of any keli, and never has a keli, and that's the Ein Sof. So you have to think about that. So is that the Zulosei? It is and it isn't.
It's like almost the marriage of the Zulaso and
Right.
God.
Right.
Because the Ein Sof, the Zulaso at that stage is within the Ein Sof, meaning it's because there's a Chalal and
he's attached to the Ein Sof.
because there's Tzimtzum and Chalal
And that,
within the Ein
and that
Sof.
makes the total entity of the Zulosei into a combination of Or and Keli, which is the fundamental organism of the Zulosei.
Right.
Now the Zulosei is an organism. It's a union of two different substitutes that work together towards a certain end.
The Zulasa.
Yeah. And this is the Ein Sof and the Yesof. If I'm going to call the Zulosei the Yesof.
Right.
These are two entities attached to each other that work together to produce what?
Tikkun Nam de Chisufa.
Yes, the Kedi needs a tikkun of Nam Sufa. But what is the theme of the organism, which is a combination of the Ein Sof and the Yeh Sof. What do they do as a combined unit? They produce what?
Olam Haba.
Right. Good. Sometimes you come out with answers. And you know, what?
I'll shut it off.
You don't look like. Okay, now that we've said Funkman, what that is and so on. Let me just. So I somewhat changed it. In other words, the world of the Ein Sof is beyond the world of the Yeh Sof. It is. You know? And that concept of Sof, Ein Sof, Yeh Sof is two separate worlds. And the Zulosai is not a being of Ein Sof. It's not. It's a being of Yeh Sof. And it will always be that way. That's why, relative to the Yeh Sof, the Ein Sof is like God.
Right.
It's the version of God which it relates to, and fundamentally it is an organism with the world of Ein Sof. That's how I it.
Because the Ein Sof, so to speak, can only exist if there is a Yesh Sof.
Right, that's the concept.
Otherwise, there's no need for Ein Sof.
Right, there's no. Right, good. You have to have a need for the Ein Sof.
Right.
Why? Because you have Atzmusoi and that's it.
Right, that's it.
So what does it have to create that? So you can't just go from Atzmusoi to Yeh Sof, really, because that's the Zulosai. And Olam Haba, fundamentally Olam Haba has a position of God. Somebody has to be God in the world of the Yeh Sof.
Right.
The Zulosai cannot be God, because he's a recipient of Olam Haba. He's the lower half of the organism. So you need an upper half, which is the Ein Sof, which is the mashpia of Olam Haba. See, Olam Haba, the structure of Olam Haba is constructed so that God is the mashpia of Olam Haba. And there has to be a mushpa of Olam Haba, and that's the Zulosai. So that's their relationship, mashpia to mushpa. And that's the fundamental structure. But the hashpor is one of a duality, a certain type of duality. But it does make the Zulosoi quasi-divine. You know what I mean? Its attachment to the Ein Sof is not simply the attachment of the Zulosoi to the Ein Sof, fundamentally is the fact that awareness comes from the Ein Sof. You know, it's the one super quality of Atzmusoi in a form that we cannot even comprehend. You know what I mean? And it shares that awareness from the Ein Sof as its God. So in that sense, it's a quasi-divine being. That's what David HaMelech meant when he said, Vatchasvei ma'at melekim. Ma'at, how little, means the Zulosoi fundamentally is an action of awareness. And where does that come from? That comes from directly from the awe of the Ein Sof. The whole thing, the whole unit,
Right.
Ein Sof and Yeh Sof, comes from Atzmusoi, which is a completely unknown attachment. So, I don't say, I think I changed my mind, and I think that the Zulosoi is really not the Ein Sof. Not really. There is such a thing as the Ein Sof as something outside of the Zulosoi. And that outside is its or, and the Zulosoi is its keli. But it's an organism, you know?
Right.
And that's what God says.
One can't exist without the other.
One cannot exist without the other. The only reason why the Ein Sof was made whatever that means, was to serve as the mashpia for the mushpa, which is the zulasai. So there's a twin there of the aspect of an organism together serving. So the entity called Olam Haba, which is the only reason why the Ein Sof was created, to allow the existence of Olam Haba through its power of Hashpah. You know what I mean? So Olam Haba is a direct result of the organism of Ein Sof Yesef. You know what I mean? That kind of makes it clearer. And it clearly distinguishes the Zulosai world, including Ein Sof, from Atzmusai. Yeah. But you're right in pointing that out. I somewhat change it. Now, the problem. Okay, so, bingo, create Olam Haba. You got the two ingredients. You have the Ein Sof as the Mashpia. You have the Zulosoi as what? As the Mushpa. So do it.
Right.
Problem.
Slow down.
Yeah. So this is where I really depart from, unfortunately, so far, at this point in time, from Kabbalah itself, Ramchal, that the problem that it has, it's not that it has to earn anything. It has to become something, which it's not. And that's called Namlik Sufa. Namlik Sufa is a problem in what the Zulosai is. It's not the problem what the Zulosai does not have.
Right.
Because the Namlik Sufa, according to the Ramchal, is something it does not have because it hasn't earned itself. And its earning is the process in what it obtains that which it needs. That's how he sees the concept of earning. You know, but I don't believe that's true at all. Why? Fundamentally, what I've always said is God is a giver. God doesn't need anything. Right. If God needs something that you have to get so that He can give it to you, that's not God anymore. That literally removes the definition of what God is.
Right.
I mean, it's nice that you say, well, we don't understand this. Abi Chochmaso, his Chochmah demanded that we have to earn something. We have to get something in a way. Well, that defies the definition of God. What do you mean? God is the only giver, pure giver. He's not a taker at all. And when you tell me that the Zulose has to earn something, he has to give this God something. He has to give it from himself, but still, there's a problem.
Right.
So, my theory of Namlik Sufa, it's not what the Zulose has to earn, it's what the Zulose has to become. That Lamaisa, the Zulose has a chasson.
Yes, the want.
In other words, he has something which God does not want, and he tells man, get rid of it.
Right.
Now, okay, so I've changed the formula, but what does he have that the Zulose has that he doesn't want?
See himself as outside.
No, but I wouldn't...
That he has to want Olam Haba.
That's something else. That this thing that the Zulose has, that God says, you can't have this.
Right.
Because if he possesses this, he will reject Olam Haba. So therefore, it goes against the entire reason of creation. You know, God says, I want to give you Olam Haba, Mazel Tov. And the Zulose says back, I don't need it.
I'm good.
I don't want, I'm good. Even though it's an illusion.
Give it to Tzedakah.
But it's an illusion because it's not true. And what's that? Simply put, the feeling of independence.
Right.
I don't need you to give me something to exist. I already exist. Thank you very much. But now that I'm here, I'm here. And God says, no, you're not here. In other words, it's an illusion. Because without God giving it to it, from Atzmutzoi down to the Ein Sof, down to the Zulosoi, the Zulosoi doesn't have existence. It never will have existence. Because you cannot have existence. Why? Because there's no such thing as existence. So if you think that you're independent of God, and you have it, that's an illusion. So God says, in order for you to accept what I want to give you, you have to understand, you have to admit, and so on, through something called an action, that you don't have it, and that you need it for me. Presto, where you going to get it? Olam haba. So God insists that you are only you are part of the organism called an Eloki organism, which is a combination of Ein Sof and Yesod. You know? But what does this mean, that he has an illusion? Well, that has to do with the nature of awareness. You see, awareness of what? Animals have a certain awareness. They have a certain awareness. But it's not that they're aware of self. They're aware of something outside of themselves, which is called, for lack of a better term, reality. There's a certain reality which dominates the universe and all the living things in it that have an awareness. So even in a certain sense, even a spider has a certain awareness.
Right.
Because we see that a spider is afraid. Of what?
Why would he be afraid unless he's aware of...
In other words, he's aware of himself in terms of something where he could lose his existence.
Right.
So what is he aware of? It's the reality has a certain existence. What that is exactly, we don't know. But the human being, the Zulosoi, is more than that. He has an awareness of what? Something which nothing has in all of creation.
Of himself.
Oh. Exactly. He has self-awareness, not reality awareness. And when you have self-awareness, whoa, you already think that you exist and that there is something called existence. There's the existence of self. And it takes God to tell you that's not true. There's no such thing as existence of self. All there is such a thing as what? Self-awareness. There's no such thing as existence. Existence is awareness. And your superiority is that you have the awareness of the existence of self. So that's a problem. Because there's something about that awareness that says directly to you, you are. So because it says you are, you think you don't need me. And you have the artificial view that you have the key word, independence. You exist outside of me. So what's wrong with that? Well, it means that I exist outside of you. It's a reciprocal thing. And that's not true. That is a sheker. Because I have no outside. There's nothing that can exist outside of me. It's not that there's nothing that can exist until it was made. It's not that. It can never be made. There's nothing can exist outside of me. Why? Because I have no outside. So this is a delusion. But on the basis of this is, in a sense, it's almost like a psychosis. It's a delusion, you know? And you have to get rid of that, or else you will reject the ability for me to be mashpir you in Olam Haba. And there's nothing more direct than that. Why? Because that's the whole purpose of God being a giver, of God being tov. You see, because God is really not a tov. God has nothing to do between Tov and Ra.
There's nothing outside to give to.
Exactly. And this is a concept that I've never really seen. I've never seen this written anywhere.
Right.
So God is not a Tov, like they say. Well, it's the nature of a Tov to do good.
Yeah.
But you're talking about a being who has an outside. When you use the nature of a being to do good, doing good means something you do to someone else. But what's the problem? There is nothing else. And there never will be something else.
Unless they're referring to the Ein Sof when they say that.
No.
I mean, the Ein Sof is made to you.
They are referring to the Ein Sof. But I don't see any clear understanding that there's a difference between Atzmusoi and the Ein Sof.
Right.
That's why I think that the clearest aspect of Einoid Mulvado doesn't mean there's nothing else out besides God. You know? But there's nothing else besides God because God has no possibility of anything outside, which means there's no outside to God and there never will be. So that means whoever Atzmusa is, it's an absolute unity. You know? So therefore God says, look, you have to masaken Naham Sufa. You know? And when you think that you are outside God, which you must, because you have self-awareness, that's the origin of the Yetzer Hara. In other words, God did not create the Yetzer Hara. And he did not create the illusion of the Yetzer Hara. That comes from how high you were created. There's no choice. Once I give you self-awareness, or you automatically have the Yetzer Hara.
Batteries included.
Right. The batteries included. So therefore, now we go down to the worlds. Given this whole state that exists before creation, now we start with creation itself. And what is creation? Creation is simply the production of the means to correct this delusion. Because you already have everything that you need for you to exist in Nitzchias. You already have that. We don't have to make that. You have that because you are quasi-divine. But the problem is not what you have. The problem is not what you don't have, so that you have to earn it. The problem is what you do have, that you think you're outside of God. You know, you see him as outside of you, and you're outside of him. That is a truth that you will never be able to transcend. The only way you can get rid of Namdik Sufa is through the awareness and of the union of the superorganism, that you are part of God. And it's that superorganism that you are not outside of him, you are not connected to him, and you are not attached to him.
You're a part of him.
You're a part of him. And that's what makes you divine, it's quasi-divine. So that answers the fundamental question, which everyone always asks. Why does God have to give you something and remove? Why does he have to remove Namlik Sufa? Or why do you have to earn it? Or what is there that you're getting that he's got to deal with? Or what? Look, God, the most powerful question of all is, well, why did God give you any feeling about what you're supposed to have so that you have to go earn something? So why is there a problem of Namlik Sufa to begin with? I mean, nothing. It doesn't make sense to say God had a problem with Namlik Sufa, but he created a problem. So if he created a problem, Why did he have to create the problem? You know?
Right, exactly.
So he had to create a problem that now he has to remove. I mean, and therefore you have to work to remove it. This makes no sense whatsoever. Why? Because God is a giver. Not really. He's not a giver because he has no outside. But if he had an outside, he would only be able to give. So the whole thing doesn't make sense. And nobody can answer that. But I believe that I answer it because I say, well, he doesn't have to give you anything. You know, he just has to remove the flaw that makes you want to drop out, that you don't need him. Because that contradicts his act of giving. So therefore, comes along the second most important act of creation. All of creation starts with the world of the Rishimu. It starts with the world of Tzimtzum. And what is it? What are you doing when suddenly you do Tzimtzum? You are not doing nothing more than, I call this decontamination. It's an important word.
Right.
What does it mean, decontamination? Well, when he created you, when he gave you self-awareness, he contaminated you. He contaminated you with the stain that you think you're independent. And that's a negative stain. That contradicts what God wants to do. So God has to remove the contradiction. That's what you have to do. You've got to get rid of it. So God has to create the mechanism which does this. And that mechanism was created by the world of Tzimtzum. Tzimtzum is nothing more than the creation of whatever's needed to get rid of the contamination. Very simply put. Now I have a clarity here. I understand why God had to build it. He had to mitzamtzum himself. I mean, all these other, he had to do it. Because he has to get rid of the contamination that will force you to reject Olam Haba. Wow. This suddenly makes sense. And when people ask the question, does God still have to do it? Is he all-powerful? No. He's not all-powerful in a certain sense. Because there is one thing that God cannot do. Really.
Right.
And what is that?
Create another God.
Right. Whatever world you live in, God can't do that.
Right.
And he will admit, I am absolute perfection, and I can't create through the act of creation another being with absolute perfection.
Right.
Because by definition,
There can only be one.
One. There's only one boss. There's one CEO for that, and that's Atzmut Sahib.
Right.
So that suddenly tells you, so in some ways self-awareness is a creation of this. It has to be gotten rid of because it comes with the creation. With the creation of the Zerosai, it automatically means that you also have the creation of a certain condition called Nam Sufa, cannot be decreated. But is Nam Sufa really a problem? Does the Zolosai really think he's outside of God? No. There's no reality to it. It's not that God has to get concerned himself with something that the Zolosai might think. Maybe I'm really not outside of God. Or maybe it's no reality to that. That's the definition of a delusion, a false belief. And God says, this is absolutely a false belief that you can exist outside of me. But that's not true. You cannot exist outside of me. But it's still something that if you're slightly less than God, that will be a contamination. And it comes from the creating something which is second only to God. Because only a human being can have what? Can have Nam Sufa. Only a human being thinks that he's a dependent of God. Only a human being is subject to that concept that he's outside of God. The possibility of that only exists in a human being. And that's the cost. I hate to say this. That's the cost of creating the human being. God created that illusion when he created man. And that's why man, from one onset, not only it's a problem that God has, that God cannot create another God. And that's what you did. So the closest thing that God ever made that was another God is the Zulasoi. You know? And that didn't even really create the problem.
Right.
Because it's still an illusion. But because you're outside of God, you always have the thought that God is a me, you duality. And you can't get rid of that. You know what I mean? That is permanent. So that's why God had to create another world called Olam Haba that does not possess Namd Ksufo. Why? Because the Zulosoi is it's the highest thing that God created that isn't God himself, which you cannot make. And once you create that, you now have to create a special environment where that entity can survive and he can exist for Nitzchias. And that's the human being. Because he has to get rid of it himself. So it's like, what's the word? So God knew this. And when I say God knew this, I mean Atzmusoi and not Atzmusoi. He knew that if he maximizes his power and creates something which is almost God himself, it will cost him. You know what I mean? Because at that level of making an almost like God, you necessarily create one side effect that God cannot remove. This is the thing. God says, I can't create another God. That's impossible. But I can create something which is almost like another God. Well, is that free of side effects? No, the medicine works perfectly, but it has one side effect.
Right.
And God says, I know. And what's that side effect? Nam Ksufa. Why? Because the Zulosai is the loser. Because he has to remove the contamination. He cannot be created without a contamination.
Right.
And could he do that? Well, he can remove the contamination. But the contamination is only an illusion. Yeah, but it's a necessary illusion. I can't make one without it. So Olam Haba has to be completely reconstructed, you see. There's a concept, not only is the Zulosoi a hischatshus, a new thing, you know, but Olam Haba as a condition of existence or something is also a new thing. You know what I mean? Because Olam Haba simply has to be created to create a situation where you can be free of this illusion. But I can't get away because the side effect to make you almost like me in a way is to have Nam Sufa. And I can't get rid of that. And the one side effect that will produce is this contamination. So I have to create a new place where you can exist that doesn't have this contamination. And this contamination, I admit, is only an illusion. It's only an illusion. It's not real. But it's a side effect. You understand this dilemma?
Yeah.
So in other words, does God have a dilemma? Yes. He has a dilemma when he creates the Butz of Adam.
There's no way around it.
And no way around it. Just like there's no way around that he can create another God. That is the truth of God. That he was so perfect, he's so great, he cannot make another God. Bingo. So when you make something which is almost like a God, bingo, you have a side effect. And the only one who can get rid of the side effect is the person you created.
Right.
You can't do it. Because if you do it,
then he doesn't have free will.
He doesn't have
he's
right.
not Chelek Elokam Imo.
Right. So in a certain sense, I call this a dilemma.
Right.
I mean, I hate to use the term because it puts a restriction of God.
Right.
You know? It's a dilemma which only man can solve. So the Sforim say, it says, well, God could solve this dilemma. You know what? He can avoid this dilemma. No, he can't. And that's why you have the Midas Adin. Midas Adin doesn't allow a solution. Why not? So that's why it says, V'chanosi eshe she'ochoin v'richamti. But so that's what it means, the Midas HaRachamim. The Midas HaRachamim doesn't avoid the Midas Adin. These forms say, you can simply say, I'm not going to listen to Midas Adin. Like God has a choice.
Right.
But the Midas Adin is what? Is based on what?
Choice.
And that choice is based on what? Emes.
Right.
Can God do something which is not emes? No. That's a contradiction to the nature of God himself. He has to listen, in a certain sense, to his own edicts and the truth. He cannot get around it. So if God says you got to remove this contamination, you got to remove it. He can't just will it away. Well, I don't want this anymore. That's what it seems to be. And maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see it. So therefore, the only way God can get rid of this sheker called Nam D'Ksufa is not by willing it away. I don't want to listen to the sheker. No. So in other words, the closer you create something which is like God, the more you are restricted to the rule of emes. And I can't get around that. And the Kabbalah does not recognize that. The invincibility and the inevitability of a contaminant, which is Nam D'Ksufa. So does it mean that God is limited? No, because the very reason why God had this problem, because he cannot give it, because he's so perfect, you know what I mean, that he cannot create another God.
It's a testament to his power, to his...
So that, right, that it's the irony that the testimony of who God is a testimony to his own power, is his inability to create another God. And that's exactly the side effect. That minimally, what comes out in the Zulosoi is an illusion, a delusion, that the person will think that he has a quality of independence. And it's part of the production of the play. You know what I mean? So I'm saying this is inevitable. So this is as far as what I understand. So therefore I'm saying the contamination of a man is due to God's perfection. Literally.
And giving over part of that perfection.
Right.
Of self-awareness.
Right. That God should give over a certain gift that he possesses in a way, self-awareness. That quality is so perfect, it doesn't oblige a limitation. It doesn't. Can't get around it. I kind of got myself in a box. But that's what I think. Does this sound reasonable?
Yeah.
Do I believe it's true? Yes. Am I 100% sure? No. Because I can't move in that zone or that sphere. So, you never know.
Right.
In any case, where are we up to? We're up to the fact that not only does the Zulose have to be created, but he has to be given a place in Nitzchias, and Nitzchias requires the removal of the contaminant called Nam Ksufa. So now the focus of Kabbalah is what is this mechanism that gets rid of the contaminant? That's the whole Kabbalah.
They're down.
That's it. So in other words, the Ramchal keeps on saying something which, I mean, he says God could do anything. So God could have created man to be much greater than he is or than he was. He could have created many more people than he did, and he was. He talks about God as God could have done this. But it seems to me that the maximum that God made was what he made. Was that a person who would have self-awareness. That is the max, because that makes man the most like God.
Right.
And that's what makes him a quasi-God. You know. Not only that, the quality of Nam Ksufa is an irreversible quality. Because man will always see himself as outside of God. How do I know that? Well, if God could have created a person who has no problem seeing himself inside of God, in spite of the fact that he has self-awareness, then God would have made that person.
Right.
And why do I say that? Why do we nail God to this restriction? The certain concept which leaps out.
Because God sees himself by himself.
Yes.
And the person, if he didn't, wouldn't have the highest quality.
Yes. But how do we know that this really restricts God?
What part specifically restricts God?
That God did not have the ability, I should say, or the wherewithal to create something even higher than self-awareness, so that there would be no problem in Nam Ksufa. Why couldn't God do that? If God can do anything, why couldn't he do that? And I'm saying he can't. Because man is the highest attempt that he ever made to create something like him. There's nothing higher than a bus of Adam. There's nothing higher than Adam Rishon. Nothing. And is that a limitation on God? Yeah. That's his maximum product. You mean he can't go above that? Couldn't he create someone without Nam Ksufa? No. Now why do I say that? Why do I have to fix God in terms of there could have been something higher which didn't have Nam Ksufa? And it's something very specific.
So you're asking for a raya or?
Yeah. Why am I forced to say that you couldn't go higher than the Zulasa in creating a mirror image of him? That's what the Torah says. He's like a dimion Eloki. Yeah. Why? Why is man at Selim Elokim? The term Selim refers to the greatest thing that would resemble you. Because the mirror image looks just like you.
Right, because you can't create another God.
Yeah. No, I have another reason. And I think it's a very powerful reason. Do you think God likes this? I mean, honestly, do we think that God likes what he did? That he created man? Do you think he enjoys this? I mean,
Currently or before the sin?
No, all of it. Before the sin, after the sin, the whole kit and caboodle. If you had a private conversation with God and you say to him, do you like what you did, what he did? God would definitely answer you and say, no.
Why?
Why do I say that? The answer is right in front of your nose, and you don't see it. Because we don't think of it in the terms. We're so convinced about the concept of what God, the concept of B'tochen, that whatever God is doing is good. We have to accept that. So when I ask God, well, you think it's easy to accept that? No. Why not? Why isn't it easy to accept that? And therefore, why don't you care? Why couldn't you create something higher than human being? What happens here? And why I believe if you ask God, are you satisfied really? Is this really what you want? God would say no. Why?
Because it creates a relationship where man despises God.
Why?
Because so much pain.
Well,
But if we're his children, he wants us to love him. He wants to have that relationship.
correct. Because God says, you think I like watching what I did? In fact, the problem, that's the one thing which makes people believe that there is no God. If you said to a person, is there a God? Everyone would say yes. Based on what? Based on what he sees in the universe. Astronomers estimate, I don't know how they know this, that there are 300 billion galaxies in the universe. Each galaxy contains 1 billion stars. 2 billion, each galaxy contains 200 billion stars. Well, you do the math.
Yeah, right.
That's like a one with like 15 zeros after it. And each star is gigantic. You know what I mean? Why is it that people deny God? They say, nope, I don't know who made the universe or where it came from, but there is no God that made it. Pain. And when God creates human history and tells man to decontaminate himself, you know how much pain involved in decontamination? Because there's so much pain that what God has to do in a certain sense is create mercy, rachamim. Because fundamentally, mankind would not survive. Because Namlik Sufa is not simply a problem. It's a real problem. The human being, by the fact that he sees God as outside of him, has a real powerful delusion. It's false, but it's very powerful. And that's why he feels shame. That's why he feels ksufa. But he's saying to himself, how can I be aware? How can I self-awareness where I really feel outside of God and accept the fact that if God is outside of me, that he can be nice or so on. I mean, the human being finds it so hard to listen to God because it's true. Even with all of that, So that's the principle of justice. God has to annihilate mankind if he holds on to the contamination. The only other way out is how?
Pain.
Being merciful. No.
Well, that is painful.
And that's where the act of mercy comes from. It's not that God is a good guy, or he feels bad, he looks all this and so on. That's not what it is. But I believe that the act of mercy comes because God feels that, in a certain sense, he is an enabler. He's the one who set this whole thing up.
Right. He had a chelik.
He has a chelik in it.
He created the problem.
He created the problem. Okay. In a certain level, you're an enabler. You enable it. So all that pain that has to exist, you, in a sense, enabled it. And not only do I say that, the Gemara says this. The chattas, the korban chattas that's born on Rosh Chodesh, which is a soya, it's a case of brings a certain soya for chattas on Rosh Chodesh. You know what that korban is for? God is bringing that korban for himself. You know that? That's what it says. Why? Because he says, it doesn't really say why. But I believe why. It's very simple. Because on a certain level, he is somewhat responsible for this entire fiasco. You know what I mean? Because even if a person's a Rosh Hashanah, why is he a Rosh Hashanah? Because you made him. You allowed him to be a Rosh Hashanah. And the problem of Namlik Sufa is so powerful that it can possibly make a person into a Rosh Hashanah. So minimally you're an enabler. Of course, you didn't do it. The man sinned because he had free will. But you enabled that. And the emeskite of God is so great that he accepts that responsibility. The fact that God brings a korban for himself, a korban chatos, is God accepting responsibility for what he did. Because when you look at the pain of mankind, it is astronomical. You know what I mean? So I don't believe that God would say, I'm happy. I'm super happy with this world. No. He would be super happy if Namlik Suf was not so powerful and mankind wouldn't sin. But I don't believe God would say, I'm happy with this world. You know? When he has to say, I know man's going to sin. I know Vada is going to sin. Because Namlik Sufa is a very difficult problem to solve. I know what I've done. I placed a load on a person's back and I've said to him, you have to decontaminate yourself. I'm sorry about it. I apologize. And no one was ever really given a choice whether he wants to accept this load. Because most people would have said, what? Namlik Sufa? You mean I have to bridge this to do mitzvahs for you and to become one? But I can't. Namlik Sufa is so powerful that it causes me shame. The only way I can remove shame, according to your principles, is if I do mitzvahs and I admit your absolute unity. But Namlik Sufa is not easy to turn down. You know? In a certain level, God knew that man would sin. Of course. And he knew that pain would be the concept, the variable that would have to coexist with humanity through all the years. I mean, it's insane. The world was supposed to be where man would fix his problem of Namlik Sufa in 6,000 years. Well, and then the Mashiach would come and suddenly would change. It's 5,785 years. We're only 215 years away from the end. And we still haven't been Zocher to Mashiach. What are we Zocher to? Well, the world is almost going to World War III. And who do we really have to blame on some level that enabled this? This is not small. And the only way to correct it is by being merciful. That means that a person has to undergo years and years of pain. This is the reality. So I don't believe God will be happy with this. And I don't care what anyone says. But obviously the pleasures and simple and joy of Nitzchias for Zulosai is so powerful, that will last forever, is so powerful that God said, I know you wouldn't do it. If I actually gave you the choice to be involved in this dilemma, you probably wouldn't do it. You know what I mean? So I'm going to force you to be involved. You know? And if you don't make it, okay. So I'm going to give you another chance. I'm going to break up Olam Haba so it's in sections and units. You get lower and lower levels, but the probability of losing Olam Haba will be very, very small. So I'm going to do you chasodim. I'm going to make it a little bit easier. It's like the pain of the Holocaust. Would anyone agree to that? That if I don't do exactly as you command, especially with Ben Ad Machaveroy, that I'm going to end up having to see my whole family and so on. You know what I mean?
Right. Absolutely not.
Yeah. You should read Castle wrote a story of the Holocaust. Very beautiful.
Recently, or?
Yeah, he posted it on.
Oh, he posted it in our chat?
It's on the Kessin, the thing.
The chat.
Yeah, you can. It's an amazing story.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And you could see the power of God. 5 minutes to tell you the story. Father was in the Holocaust with his family, and so on, and his wife was killed by the Nazis, and his daughter and two daughters, whatever, they were killed by the Nazi, and all that was left was his son. He and his son were still alive, and they were wanting to put them on a death march or something like that, and so on. So there was some kind of fight or something like that. So suddenly he was separated from his son. And then when it was finally over, he said, "Where's my son?" So someone said to him, "He died. He was killed by the Nazis, in the skirmish." So the man said, "Oh yeah, so why is this relevant?" Because there was a man that was walking through, I think, a park or so on, and he saw a man, a Jewish man that he saw him eating treif. So he said to him, do you know that what you're eating is treif? So the man said, "I know it's treif, and that's why I'm eating it." Why? Because God took away my son, and I thought I would at least have him. So I've decided for the rest of my life, when God wants me to do X, I will do not X. Just because he did this, I will express my pain and rage at God for the rest of my life. This will be my avodah.
Mm.
So he said that so he tried to talk him out of it, he couldn't. So a couple of years later, he was in Yerushalayim, visiting Israel, and he's walking down the street and he sees a bench and he sees an old man sitting on the bench, and guess who it is? It's this man that he saw originally in Poland or whatever it was. So he walked over to him and says, "Do you recognize me?" The guy says, "Yeah, I recognize you." So he said to him, "But you're still eating treif." He says, "Yup, I'm eating treif, and I'll do that for the rest of my life. That's what I feel about God and doing this." So what happened? So the man says, "Yeah, I think it was Yom Kippur, it was some holiday." So the man says, "Why don't we at least go in a shul, and be maskeh his name when they call him up to the Torah and so on, at least they'll do a chesed for your son." So he says, "No, I don't want to do that." So finally he convinced him, and the guy said, "Okay, so I'll do that for my son." So they both get up and they walk down the street looking for a shul, and suddenly there's a shul that appears to them. So they go in the shul and so on, and so on. So they're looking for the Rabbi who's in charge of this thing, and they finally see the Rabbi, and he says, "I'd like you to be maskeh the name of a person who died in the Holocaust," and so on and so forth, and so on. So the Rabbi said, "What's the guy's name?" So he tells him the name, Eliezer ben something like that, his son, what his name was.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly the Rabbi says to him, "What? So he looks at the guy and he says, Tati? In other words, that was his son that he thought died. He didn't die. So they're looking around for a shul, and Dafka, just the shul that they find, and the man, he confronts his son. So what did the man do? He fainted. And that's the story. Very powerful. But that's God saying, it's enough of your suffering. You're going to still see him. You're going to go to exactly the shul that he's in, where he's the Rabbi, and he will be appeared to you again. I'm going to stop the pain. But when you think of that, I mean, you see, it's mamash a nace from God. That the shul that he picked, what his son was in it. That what are the odds of that? So that's the pain. And if you were told that, Father, I'm going to bring you on the world and you're going to be a Zulasoi, you're going to have to try and remove Nam Sufa. But if you don't, for some reason, and the Midas Adin comes after you, I have to punish you. How? Because this is what's going to happen to you in the Holocaust. Would he have said, okay, I'll take this?
No. Capital no.
So that's one story that tells me why God is not happy with what he did.
Right, isn't it there's the Chazal that says that when Hashem is going to bring a soul down, the soul fights, he doesn't want to go. And God forces him.
Yeah. It's all there.
Because he shows him everything that's going to happen to him, and the soul says no.
So what I'm saying, that's how I know God would say, no, I'm not happy. And that God, in a certain sense, Kavyochel, he doesn't feel pain, but if he feels this, and it's not a position he wants to be in. He'd rather not do this. But he knows the cheshbonos of living forever in a joy. I mean, these are cheshbonos. So he knows that. So that's why people don't know what they're talking about. That God himself is disturbed by what he has to do. But in the end, what he has to do is what's worth it. You know. So that, the fact that God has become a perpetrator of pain, even if it's for the right reason, and he's completely justified, this would cause pain to anyone. So that's why God is a Marachim. Because he knows what he's doing. And he has to do it because it's a side effect. It's a side effect of creating someone who was who is slightly less than you. Do I make sense?
Yeah.
So I'm pointing out very powerful variables. This is not simple. It's not simple for God. It's not even simple for the boss of a dome that has to undergo this. So we see all the things about God. So today we discussed the concept of Atzmusoi, Ein Sof and Zulosoi, the relationship. And finally, the ultimate Chochmah of Kabbalah. What is Kabbalah? It's a Chochmah of what? Simply decontamination. In one word.
Right.
Why? Because that's the side effect that must come with the Zulosoi. That's true. Now, am I 100% right? I don't really know. You know, somebody may come up with some, but it seems to me that given the circumstances, that's why I see that's what Ramchal wrote and so on, and even Yari, that they're oversimplifying it. That even God himself would be murder. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry I gave you the opportunity, but I'm sorry that forcefully you were born. And I bear that responsibility by having to bring a chatas. And that's it.